How's everybody doing? I've got chapter 24 here of book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. At the last moment, Gillen changed his point of aim. Somehow, it went against the grain to kill an unarmed, unsuspecting man, even an enemy. However, the swimmer had to be stopped, and the target area he offered was small. Only his head and shoulders showed above the surface of the river. Gillen selected his right shoulder as an aiming point and released. He heard the other four bows shoot, almost at the same time, following his lead. His arrow plunged down in a shallow arc and struck the lead swimmer in the right shoulder. The man let out a cry of agony and stopped swimming. Almost immediately, he sank beneath the water, only to surface again a meter downstream, churning the water to foam with his left arm and crying out in pain. His comrades on the riverbank stared at him in a panic for a few seconds. Then, as his cries continued, they began to haul in on the rope, dragging him back toward the bank. He turned on his back in the water, feebly kicking with his feet, thrashing the surface in an attempt to get back to the bank. The other archers didn't have the luxury of choosing to wound their targets. Gillen was a superlative shot, and he could aim at the swimmer's shoulder with confidence. His companions couldn't hope for that sort of accuracy, and the swimming men offered them only small targets. One of them was hit in the chest, the arrow plunging through the water almost unimpeded to strike him 20 centimeters below the surface. He cried out once, threw up his hands, and sank without a further sound. The rope handlers hauled on his rope, and he reappeared after a few meters, lying on his back, limp and unmoving, as they pulled him back to the bank. The third swimmer yelled out in fear as 3 arrows whipped viciously into the water around him. One of them was close enough to graze his arm with its razor-sharp warhead, and blood started reddening the water around him. In response to his frantic cries, his companions began dragging him back through the water as fast as they could. A sizable wave built up around him as the current ran over his fast-moving body. Inevitably, some of it went into his mouth, and he began coughing and gagging. "Stop shooting," Gillen ordered quietly. "Stand down." There was no point in wasting further arrows. The swimmers had been turned back, and once again, the enemy were in disarray. The men tending the ropes shouted to their comrades to cover them with their shields, a request their friends weren't overly keen on fulfilling, since they planned to stay protected by the shields themselves. Seeing an opportunity to demoralize the men further, Gillen loosed an arrow at the group on the bank, targeting one of the rope handlers. The arrow hit him in the leg, and he fell awkwardly to the grass, clasping both hands to the wound and appealing to his friends for help. They ignored him, working harder to drag the injured swimmer to the bank. As he rolled into the shallows, 2 of them dashed forward and, grabbing him by the arms, began to drag him backward toward the tree line, heedless of his cries of pain. The second swimmer, hit in the chest, was obviously dead when he grounded in the shallows. He made no move to rise, and his arms and legs moved weakly in the current. His rope handlers, after a moment's hesitation, cut the rope attached to him and ran for the trees, one of them pausing to assist the man with the leg wound. The current continued to move the dead swimmer until he gradually drifted away from the bank and downriver. He rolled over once so that he was floating face down. Then, he was lost to sight as the river took him round a slight curve. The third swimmer, blood flowing down his arm, scrambled to his feet as he reached the shallows and splashed ashore. He wasted no time on his friends, setting out at a dead run for the safety of the trees. The rope trailed behind him, snaking through the long grass. Gillen sent an arrow hissing past his ear to speed him along. Surprisingly, the man found extra reserves of speed and redoubled his efforts to reach safety. Then, the inevitable happened. The trailing rope snagged round a low tree stump and jerked tight, bringing him crashing to the ground. He rolled around frantically, yelling in fear and thrashing at the ground as he sought to cast the rope loose. Then, finally free, he lurched to his feet and took off again. The watching archers chuckled. Gillen narrowed his eyes, scanning the rope-handling party still on the far bank. Huddled behind their shields, they began to retreat slowly away from the river. He could see that they had no idea where the sudden hail of arrows had come from. None of them was looking at the row of bushes. They were all scanning the riverbank directly opposite them. He gave them a few more minutes as they retreated cautiously. As before, when no sudden hail of arrows eventuated, their confidence grew, and they stood more upright, still with the shields in front of them, as they backed away and began to move faster. "Walt, Gilbert, get going," Gillen said. "Stay low, and keep these bushes between you and them. When you reach your horses, walk them for the first 20 meters. Don't suddenly gallop away, or you'll be heard." The two archers grunted their understanding, and, staying in a crouch, duck walked on their haunches away from the bushes, staying low until they were inside the tree line. Once he was assured they were on their way, Gillen resumed his watch on the far bank. The enemy were milling around the two injured swimmers, now that they had assisted them back to the tree line. The one Gillen had shot looked to be in a bad way. They laid him on the ground, and he could see several medical orderlies bringing a litter for him. As before, their leader raged impotently, but after several minutes, sensing the silent animosity of his men, he moderated his behavior, trying to be more conciliatory. Nestor, the senior archer, moved up alongside Gillen to watch, and chuckled quietly. "Think they'll try again, Ranger?" he asked. Gillen shrugged. "I don't know how they'd go about it. They're sitting ducks once they get into the water, and they know it. He'll have a hard time persuading them to try it again. The only thing I can think of is for them to cross while wearing armor." "They'll sink if they do," Nestor replied. Gillen shrugged. "Maybe a heavy breastplate and helmet might keep a man on his feet," he said. "If they can stop being swept away, it might give them a chance." Nestor patted his quiver, where the feathered ends of his arrows rustled as he touched them. He withdrew one, fitted with a hardened, tapering bodkin point. "That is, until we put one of these beauties through his breastplate," he said. Bodkin arrows were designed to penetrate armor. The archers carried a mixed selection of bodkins and leaf-shaped barbed warheads in their quivers. "True," Gillen agreed. "They may not know we have armor-piercing arrows. We haven't used them so far." "Be another nasty shock for them, won't it?" Nestor said. He sounded as if he were very pleased with the idea of surprising the enemy yet again. Gillen continued to watch the foxes. Now that the first flurry of activity looking after the injured swimmers had passed, they appeared to be having an animated discussion. Faintly, the ranger could hear shouted comments and voices raised in anger, although he couldn't make out the words themselves. Whatever they were discussing, it was going to be a while before they could organize a further attempt on the ford. "Nestor," he said, "you and Cleet might as well get going. Remember, stay low until you're in the trees. Then move off slowly once you're mounted." Nestor sniffed. "Happy to stay here with you if you like, Ranger," he said. Gillen grinned at him. The old warhorse was enjoying this, he thought, but he waved him away. "I appreciate the offer, but you'd better be on your way. I can hold the fort here for a while longer." "That's true enough," Nestor agreed. He had no misconceptions about Gillen's skill. He knew the ranger was a better shot, a far better shot, than himself or any of his men, and Gillen was fast. He could send a hail of arrows, all aimed shots, whistling through the air at the enemy, making them think they were facing 3 or 4 shooters. "All right, Cleet," Nestor said, turning to the other archer. "Let's make a move. Stay low now." Like the others, they crept out of the bushes while doubled down on their haunches to stay concealed. Gillen watched them go, then looked back to the foxes. They were still debating, still moving around uncertainly. There would be no further threat from them for some time, he thought. He settled down to wait, wondering what they would try next. When they did make a move, his earlier prediction, spoken half in jest, turned out to be correct. A group of 5 men, huddled behind hastily constructed wooden, man-high shields, advanced on the riverbank. Among them was a man wearing a helmet and metal breastplate and carrying a smaller, circular shield. He was a squat, stocky figure, made even more so by the fact that he was wearing the armor. Gillen assumed that there was a layer of chainmail underneath the breastplate. He selected a bodkin point arrow from his quiver and waited. The small group stopped a few meters from the riverbank. Hastily, one of them wound the end of a rope around the armored man's waist, tied it off, then retreated behind the makeshift shield wall. Another stayed beside the would-be crosser, protecting him with a long shield. The shield-bearer walked with him to the water's edge, scanning the far bank anxiously, trying to see some sign of movement, some indication that they were about to be shot at. Then, as the armored man slipped into the river and waded quickly forward until he was waist-deep, the shield-bearer skipped back to the relative safety of the shield wall behind him. The armored man now raised the small shield he carried so that it covered his head and upper body. He steadied himself, testing the strength of the current as it pushed at him, then took a few tentative steps forward. It appeared that Gillen's supposition had been correct. The weight of the armor and helmet helped stabilize him against the fierce tug of the current, but that was somewhat offset by the uneven nature of the riverbed. 3 times in the first 10 meters, he had to stop to regain his balance as the river threatened to topple him. Then he continued, walking slowly, testing each step. "Mind how you go," Gillen said softly. "If you fall, they're going to have to drag you out in a hurry." 3 more paces. The man swayed, then recovered. He advanced farther. He was now a third of the way across the river, the shield held up in front of his face and upper body. Gillen nodded in admiration. This was a brave man, he thought. He was also an intelligent one. Unlike those who had gone before him, he wasn't growing overconfident when there was no sign of opposition. He continued to move deliberately, expecting a volley of arrows at any minute. Halfway across. Still, he continued his steady, patient progress. Occasionally, as his footing became uneven, the shield would dip momentarily as he regained his balance. But it was impossible for Gillen to predict when this would happen, and there was never enough time to release a shot while the shield was down. He recovered quickly each time. 3/4 of the way. The river began to shallow at this point, and he crouched, staying low, so that the water reached almost to his neck, with the circular shield protecting his exposed face and shoulders. On the far side, his companions shouted encouragement as they saw him wading closer and closer to the bank, without any sign of resistance. Back in the trees, the rest of the foxes joined in the chorus of support, cheering and whistling. He was in the shallows now, still crouching behind the cover of the shield. Gillen selected a second arrow from his quiver, holding it loosely between the fingers of his bow hand. Then, rising to his feet, he aimed and shot. The armored man was wading up the bank, water cascading from him, draining out of the metal breastplate. He stayed low and with the shield held protectively before him, until Gillen's first arrow hit it and knocked it sideways. The second shot was already on its way while the first was in the air. As quickly as the man tried to recover, bringing his shield back in front of his body, the arrow was even quicker. It slammed into the unprotected breastplate with the full force of Gillen's massive bow behind it. At such a short range, the armor had no chance against the hardened steel point. It ripped through the breastplate and into the man's body. He reeled back into the shallow water. As it reached up to his calves, it tripped him, and he toppled backward into the shallows. The shouts of encouragement from the far bank fell silent as the foxes watched their comrade lying still in the river. Gillen studied him carefully. He was weighted down by the breastplate, helmet, and shield. The current didn't seem to be moving him as it had moved the previous crosser. There was always the chance that he might be heavy enough to anchor the rope on this side and allow another swimmer to cross. Coming to a decision, Gillen loosed a volley of 6 arrows at the men on the opposite bank. The arrows rained down in rapid succession, thudding into shields and exposed limbs. It was too much for the men to bear. They had been lashed by these arrow storms twice before, and now they simply broke and ran. Knowing that all eyes would be on them for a few minutes, Gillen slipped around the end of the line of bushes and sprinted for the riverbank, drawing his sacks as he went. He stooped over the body of the armored man and quickly slashed the loop of rope around his upper body. The loose end of the rope floated away in the current. Satisfied, Gillen turned and ran back to the bushes. He'd wait a while longer, then head out after Horace and the rest of the party. It would be some time, he thought, before the foxes attempted another crossing. All right, that's going to conclude Chapter 24. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you all next time in Chapter 25. God bless, and have a good one.